The town of Havenwood, North Carolina, was a postcard of American charm. Oak trees, older than the town itself, lined streets of tidy houses with welcoming porches and blooming azalea bushes. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the rhythm of life was as predictable as the seasons. On Tuesday mornings, the farmers' market filled the town square with the scent of fresh peaches and boiled peanuts. On Friday nights, the high school football stadium buzzed under bright lights, and every day, at the corner of Main and Elm, a small coffee shop called the Daily Grind served as the town's living room. It was in this cozy, predictable world that Anya Sharma tried to build a quiet life. At 28 she was a newcomer, having moved to Havenwood 6 months ago. She'd bought a small, neglected cottage on the edge of town, and spent her days sanding floors, patching drywall, and coaxing a vegetable garden back to life. She was a solitary figure, polite but distant. Her routine was simple: a morning run with her 3-legged dog, a rescue she called Trip, hours of hard work on her house, and a late afternoon visit to the Daily Grind for a cup of black coffee. But Anya carried something with her that Havenwood couldn't ignore, something that disrupted its placid surface. Scars. A web of them traced a path from her left temple, down her cheek, and disappeared into the collar of her shirt. They were not faint, silvery lines that time had softened. They were angry, puckered marks, a permanent record of a violence the town could only imagine. The scar tissue pulled at the corner of her eye, giving her a look of perpetual watchfulness, and tugged at her mouth, making a true smile a rare and precious sight. The whispers started almost immediately. They were quiet at first, exchanged over picket fences and in the aisles of the grocery store. Did you see the new woman? What on earth happened to her face? The theories were as varied as they were imaginative. A car accident, some said. A house fire, others guessed. The more dramatic storytellers whispered about a jealous ex-husband or a life of crime she'd left behind. No one considered the truth. In their peaceful world, the truth was unthinkable. The whispers found a home at the Daily Grind. It was there, amidst the clatter of ceramic mugs and the hiss of the espresso machine, that the town's curiosity festered into something uglier. The unofficial court of Havenwood opinion was presided over by a group of women who gathered at the same corner table every afternoon. They were led by Carol Pritchard, the wife of a successful real estate developer and a woman who believed her social standing gave her the right to pass judgment on everyone. Her companions were Brenda, who ran the local gossip blog, and Janice, a retired schoolteacher who had forgotten more about kindness than she had ever taught. Anya was their favorite topic. They watched her every move from the moment she walked in, her worn work boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. They noted her simple, practical clothes, jeans and a plain t-shirt, no matter the weather. They dissected her quiet demeanor, her lack of makeup, her hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. They saw her as an outsider, an anomaly, and her scars were the physical proof of her otherness. There she is, Carol would murmur, taking a delicate sip of her latte. You'd think she'd at least try to cover that up. A little concealer can work wonders. I don't think any amount of makeup could hide that mess, Brenda would add, her fingers tapping away on her phone, likely composing a new, thinly veiled post about the mysterious stranger in town. It's just unsettling. It ruins the whole atmosphere of the place. Janice, who prided herself on her sharp observations, would nod in agreement. She never smiles, never says more than hello and thank you. It's unnatural. People with nothing to hide are friendly. Anya heard them. She wasn't deaf. The acoustics of the small shop carried their stage whispers directly to her table, and the back she would sit with her back to the wall, a habit she couldn't shake, and stare out the window at the quiet street. Her coffee would grow cold in her hands as their words washed over her. She never reacted. Her face, already a mask of scar tissue, remained impassive. Her shoulders never slumped, her hands never trembled. She simply absorbed their casual cruelty, another burden to be carried in silence. Inside, however, a storm raged. Each whisper was a grain of salt in an open wound. Each judgmental glance was a phantom pain from a past she fought every day to keep buried. She had come to Havenwood seeking peace, a place where she could be anonymous, where the ghosts of her past couldn't find her. She had hoped the quiet rhythm of small-town life would be a balm for her soul. Instead, it had become a new kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were words and the attacks were silent and insidious. One particularly warm afternoon in late spring, Anya was working in her front yard, digging up the roots of an overgrown wisteria vine that was threatening the foundation of her porch. Sweat trickled down her temples, stinging the sensitive skin of her scars. Trip was lying in a patch of shade, his one good back leg twitching as he dreamed. Anya was lost in the rhythm of the work, the satisfying thud of the shovel hitting the earth, the pull of the stubborn roots. For a few moments, she felt a sense of peace. Then a car slowed down as it passed her house. It was Carol Pritchard, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair visible through the window of her luxury SUV. She didn't wave, she just stared, her expression a mixture of morbid curiosity and distaste. Anya met her gaze for a brief second before Carol accelerated and drove away. The peace of the moment was shattered. Anya dropped the shovel and sat down heavily on the porch steps. She buried her face in her hands, her calloused fingers tracing the familiar, jagged lines on her skin. She wasn't crying, she hadn't cried in years, but the weight of it all pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She had survived explosions that had torn metal apart. She had walked through fire and chaos. She had held friends in her arms as they took their last breaths, and yet, here she was, in this peaceful little town, being broken down by the whispers of people who had never known a day of real hardship. Tripp limped over and nudged her hand with his wet nose, whining softly. He was a survivor, too. He'd been found on the side of a highway, starved and injured, but he had never lost his capacity for love and trust. Anya wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his soft fur. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. "It's just people." Later that day, she went to the daily grind. She needed to prove to herself that their words couldn't break her. As she walked in, the conversation at the corner table stopped abruptly. All three women turned to look at her, their eyes immediately drawn to her face. Today the stares felt sharper, more pointed. Carol had clearly shared the story of her drive-by viewing. Anya ignored them and walked to the counter. The young barista, a high school girl named Sarah, gave her a small, sympathetic smile. Sarah was always kind, always treated her like any other customer. "The usual, Anya?" Sarah asked. "Yes, please, Sarah, black coffee." As she waited, she heard Carol's voice, louder this time, deliberately carrying across the room. "I just don't understand why someone like that would choose to live here. Havenwood is a family town. We have a certain image to maintain. All those scars. It's just not good for property values." Brenda snickered. "Maybe she thinks it makes her look tough, like some kind of movie character." This time, something inside Anya snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, seismic shift. She had endured so much. She had sacrificed parts of herself she could never get back. She had worn her scars not as a badge of honor, but as a quiet testament to her survival. And these women, in their safe, comfortable lives, were turning her survival into a spectacle, a stain on their perfect town. She took her coffee from Sarah, her hands steady. She turned, not towards her usual table in the back, but towards the corner table. She walked slowly, each step deliberate. The three women fell silent, their smug expressions faltering as she approached. They looked like startled birds. Their gossip interrupted. Anya stopped in front of their table. She didn't say a word. She just looked at them, her gaze moving from Carol to Brenda to Janice. She let the silence stretch, filling the space between them. For the first time, they were forced to look at her not as a distant object of curiosity, but as a person standing right in front of them. They saw the intelligence in her one undamaged eye, the strength in her jaw, the way she held herself with a quiet dignity that they could never understand. Carol was the first to break. She fidgeted with her diamond bracelet, a nervous flush creeping up her neck. "Can we help you with something?" she asked, her voice losing some of its usual authority. Anya held their gaze for a moment longer. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of agreement or submission. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. She saw them. She saw their smallness, their casual cruelty, and she would not let it destroy her. Without a word, she turned and walked to her table. She sat down, her back to the wall, and took a sip of her coffee. It was hot and bitter, just the way she liked it. The whispers did not resume. For the rest of the afternoon, the corner table was uncharacteristically silent. The women of Havenwood had, for the first time, been confronted by the object of their scorn, and they had found that she was not as easily dismissed as they had thought. Anya knew it wasn't a victory. It was just a brief ceasefire in a war she was still fighting alone. But as she sat there, with the warmth of the coffee spreading through her, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a tiny spark of defiance, a quiet refusal to be broken. And for now, it was enough. The confrontation at the coffee shop, as quiet as it was, changed things. The whispers didn't stop, but they became more furtive, more cautious. When Anya entered the daily grind. Carol and her friends would fall silent, their eyes darting away as if they'd been caught doing something shameful. They still watched her, but now their curiosity was tinged with a sliver of fear. The kind of fear small-minded people feel when confronted with something they don't understand and can't control. Anya, for her part, tried to put the incident behind her. She had made her point, not with words but with presence. Now she wanted nothing more than to retreat back into the quiet solitude of her life. She continued to work on her house, finding a deep satisfaction in the physical labor. She repaired the leaky roof, replaced the rotting porch steps, and painted the faded shutters a deep forest green. With each repaired shingle and each fresh coat of paint, she felt like she was not just rebuilding a house, but rebuilding herself. Her garden began to thrive under her patient care. Rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers grew strong and green. She found a sense of peace in the simple act of nurturing life, of coaxing growth from the soil. It was a stark contrast to a past where her hands had been trained for destruction. Here, in this small patch of earth, she could create, she could heal. Her only regular companion was Trip. The three-legged dog was her shadow, following her from room to room, lying at her feet as she worked, and resting his head on her lap in the evenings. He was a constant, comforting presence, a living creature who didn't see her scars. He saw only the person who had saved him, the person who fed him and threw his favorite squeaky toy, the person who offered him a gentle hand and a soft voice. His unconditional acceptance was a balm to her wounded spirit. But the past was never far away. It lived in the silence of her small house. It came to her in the dead of night, in dreams that left her tangled in her sheets, her heart pounding, the scent of sand and smoke thick in her throat. In these dreams, she was back in the dust and chaos of a world away, the screams of her comrades echoing in her ears. She would wake up with a gasp, the phantom weight of her gear pressing down on her, the familiar ache in her leg, a throbbing reminder of the day her life had been irrevocably altered. It was on one of these sleepless nights, as she sat on her porch watching the moon rise over the trees, that she felt a new kind of unease. It wasn't the familiar ghost of a memory. It was something else, something present, a feeling of being watched. She scanned the darkness, her senses on high alert. The street was empty. The houses around her were dark and silent. There was nothing but the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze. She told herself it was just her nerves, a side effect of her hypervigilance, a state of being she had lived in for so long that it had become her normal. But the feeling persisted over the next few days. Sometimes, on her morning runs with Trip along the wooded trails behind her house, she would catch a flicker of movement in the trees, a shadow that seemed to disappear as soon as she turned her head. Once, while working in her garden, she heard the distinct snap of a twig from the woods that bordered her property. When she looked up, there was nothing there. She began to doubt herself. Was she becoming paranoid? Was the isolation finally getting to her? She had been alone for so long, first in crowded barracks where she felt like an outsider, and now in this quiet town where she was treated like one. Perhaps her mind was starting to play tricks on her. The feeling came to a head one afternoon. When she was returning from the hardware store, she had parked her old pickup truck and was carrying a heavy bag of concrete mix towards her house when she saw him. A man was standing across the street, partially hidden by the shade of a large oak tree. He was tall and thin, dressed in nondescript clothes, jeans and a grey hoodie. Despite the warmth of the day, he was just standing there, watching her house. Anya's training kicked in instantly. She didn't stare. She didn't let on that she had seen him. She continued walking towards her porch, her movements calm and measured, but her mind was racing, assessing the situation. Was he just a curious neighbor, a lost tourist, or was it something more? She set the bag of concrete down on the porch with a heavy thud and glanced back across the street. The man was gone. He had vanished as silently as he had appeared. A chill ran down Anya's spine that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the echo of a footfall she had been trained to recognize, the silent tread of someone who knew how to go unseen. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her darkened living room, a heavy-duty flashlight on the table beside her, and watched. The street Trip, sensing her anxiety, lay at her feet, his ears perked, a low growl rumbling in his chest every so often. The hours ticked by, marked only by the slow sweep of headlights from the occasional passing car. There was no sign of the man in the grey hoodie. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was a birdwatcher. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe it had nothing to do with her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it did. Her scars, her past, her very presence in this town made her a target for curiosity. But this felt different. This felt like surveillance. The next day, she decided to change her routine. Instead of her usual run on the wooded trail, she took Trip for a walk through the center of town. She wanted to be in a public place, surrounded by people. As she walked past the daily grind, she saw Carol and her friends at their usual table. They saw her too, and immediately started whispering amongst themselves. For once, Anya was almost grateful for their predictable pettiness. It was a familiar threat, a known quantity. The man in the gray hoodie was an unknown, and that was far more dangerous. She was about to cross the street to head back home when she saw him again. He was standing at the far end of the town square near the war memorial. He was partially obscured by a group of tourists taking pictures, but she recognized his tall, thin frame and the gray hoodie. He wasn't looking at her this time. He was looking at the memorial, his head bowed as if he were reading the names engraved on the granite slab. Anya's heart began to beat a little faster. Was it a coincidence? Was he just another person paying his respects? Or was he sending her a message? The war memorial was a sacred place in Havenwood. It listed the names of the town's sons who had fallen in every conflict since World War I. It was a place of quiet reverence, a reminder of the cost of freedom. She watched him for a long moment, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Who was he? What did he want? Was he connected to her past? Was he a threat? She had come to Havenwood to escape the ghosts of her former life, but what if one of them had followed her? Just then, the man looked up, his gaze sweeping across the square. For a split second, his eyes met hers. Anya felt a jolt, a shock of recognition that was so unexpected, so impossible, that she thought she must be mistaken. The man's face was gaunt and pale, his eyes hollowed out with a pain she knew all too well, but behind the pain, behind the years of hardship that had carved new lines on his face, she saw a flicker of the boy she had once known. That it was Mark Jensen, a name she hadn't spoken or even thought in years, a name that belonged to a ghost. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent warning. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of tourists. Anya stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hand clutching Trip's leash so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The sounds of the town square faded into a dull roar in her ears. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mark Jensen was supposed to be dead. He had been in the vehicle with her, the vehicle that had been torn apart by the explosion that had given her her scars. She had been the one to pull him from the wreckage. She had held him, tried to stop the bleeding, tried to keep him conscious. She had watched the life fade from his eyes. She had been told he hadn't made it, but he was here, in Havenwood, watching her. The carefully constructed walls of her quiet life came crashing down around her. The whispers of the town, the judgmental stares, the petty cruelty, it all seemed insignificant now. A real ghost from her past had just walked through her present, and she had no idea if he had come as a friend or a foe. She turned and hurried home, her mind reeling. Trip, sensing her distress, trotted close to her side, his one good back leg working hard to keep up. When she got back to her cottage, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The past she had tried so hard to bury had just been dug up, and she had a terrible feeling that the man in the gray hoodie was not the only ghost who had followed her to Havenwood. The quiet life she had so desperately sought was over. The echo of a footfall had just become the thunder of an approaching storm. The sighting of Mark Jensen sent Anya into a spiral of controlled panic. For the first time since she had been medically discharged, the carefully constructed calm she had built around herself shattered. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. Every creak of her old house, every rustle of leaves outside her window, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She started checking the locks on her doors and windows obsessively. She reactivated security protocols she hadn't used in years. Simple things like varying her routes, checking for tails, and never sitting with her back to a door. Trip, her ever-faithful companion, became her furry, three-legged security system. He seemed to sense the shift in her, the return of the coiled tension she had carried for so long. He was more alert, his ears constantly twitching, a low growl rumbling in his chest at the slightest unfamiliar sound. He slept by her bed, a warm, reassuring presence in the long, dark nights. Anya's mind was a battlefield of questions. How was Mark alive? The medics had told her he was gone. She had seen his name on a memorial wall back at the base. Had it all been a lie? And if so, why? And why was he here, in Havenwood, watching her from the shadows? Was he a threat? Or was he like her, a ghost looking for a place to rest? Her visits to the daily grind became less frequent. She couldn't stand the thought of dealing with Carol Pritchard and her cronies while her world was tilting on its axis. The petty drama of the coffee shop seemed absurd in the face of this new, terrifying reality. But on the few occasions she did go, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The whispers about her had been replaced by a new topic of conversation, one that had the whole town buzzing. General Theron Miller was coming to Havenwood. The name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and excitement. General Miller was a living legend, a 4-star general who had served for over 40 years. He was a hero from a bygone era, a man who had led troops in every major conflict since Vietnam. He was also, as it turned in, a Havenwood native. He had grown up in the very town he was now returning to as the guest of honor for the annual Memorial Day parade and ceremony. The news was everywhere. The local paper ran a front-page story with a picture of the general, his face a roadmap of integrity and command, his chest covered in a rainbow of ribbons. The mayor announced that a statue would be unveiled in his honor in the town square. It was the biggest thing to happen in Havenwood in decades. Carol Pritchard was in her element as the self-appointed head of the town's social committee. She was in charge of organizing a special reception for the general. She talked about it incessantly at the daily grind, her voice filled with self-importance. The reception will be at the country club, of course, she announced one afternoon, loud enough for the whole shop to hear. I've already spoken with the caterer. We'll have champagne and cognacs, only the best for a man like General Miller. Brenda, her loyal scribe, was nodding enthusiastically. It's going to be the event of the year. Everyone who's anyone will be there, Janice, the retired teacher, added. It's so important for the children to see a real American hero. A man of his stature, his dignity. It's an inspiration. Anya listened from her table in the back, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The general's visit felt like a storm on the horizon, a massive weather system moving inexorably closer, threatening to disrupt everything in its path. She had no desire to be part of the town's celebration. She wanted to lock her doors, close her curtains, and wait for it to pass, but the world seemed to be conspiring against her. A few days later, a flyer appeared in her mailbox. It was an invitation to all residents of Havenwood to attend the Memorial Day ceremony in the town square. The flyer featured a prominent picture of General Miller. Anya stared at his face, a face she had only ever seen in official military photographs. There was a time when a man like that would have been her commander-in-chief, the top of a chain of command that had defined her entire existence. Now, he was just a reminder of a world she had desperately tried to leave behind. The pressure to participate was immense. In a town like Havenwood, not attending the Memorial Day ceremony was tantamount to treason. It was a sacred civic duty, a day to honor the fallen and celebrate the living. To be absent would be to mark oneself as an outsider, a pariah. Anya knew that if she didn't go, the whispers would start again, louder and more vicious than ever. They would see her absence as proof of her disrespect, her lack of patriotism. She was torn. Part of her wanted to defy them, to stay home and let them think what they wanted. But another part of her, the part that still yearned for a quiet, peaceful life, knew that she couldn't afford to isolate herself further. She had to make an effort to show that she was part of the community, even if that community had treated her with such casual cruelty. And then there was Mark. She hadn't seen him since that day in the town square, but his presence lingered like a ghost. Was he still here? Would he be at the ceremony? The thought of seeing him again, of potentially having to confront him in a public place, filled her with a mixture of dread and a strange, desperate hope. She needed answers. She needed to know what had happened to him, why he had let her believe he was dead for all these years. The days leading up to Memorial Day were tense. The town was in a frenzy of preparation. American flags appeared on every porch and lamppost. A high school band practiced patriotic tunes until they were perfect. Carol Pritchard bustled around town, her voice a constant, shrill presence as she micromanaged every detail of the celebration. Anya tried to lose herself in her work. She built a new fence around her garden. Each post she drove into the ground a release for her pent-up anxiety. She worked until her muscles ached and her hands were raw, hoping that physical exhaustion would bring her some measure of peace. But even in her work, she couldn't escape the sense of impending doom. The night before the ceremony, a real storm rolled in. Thunder rattled the windows of her small cottage, and lightning lit up the sky, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. Anya sat in the dark, with Tripp's head on her lap, and watched the storm. It felt like a reflection of the turmoil inside her. She thought about her scars, the permanent map of a single, catastrophic moment. They were a testament to her survival, but they were also a constant source of pain, both physical and emotional. She had learned to live with them, to accept them as part of who she was, but she had never learned to deal with the way other people saw them. To the people of Havenwood, her scars were a mark of otherness, a symbol of something broken and ugly. They couldn't see the story behind them, the story of sacrifice, of courage, of a promise she had made to a dying friend. She thought about Mark. What scars did he carry? Were they visible like hers, or were they hidden deep inside, festering in the darkness? She remembered him as a boy, barely 20, his face full of a goofy, optimistic charm. He had been her friend, her brother in arms. They had shared everything: rations, stories from home, the bone-deep terror of waiting for an attack, and then, in a flash of fire and shrapnel, he was gone, or so she had thought. As the storm outside began to subside, a sense of resolve settled over Anya. She would go to the ceremony. She would stand in the town square with her head held high. She would not hide. She would not be intimidated by the whispers of the crowd or the ghosts of her past. She was a survivor. She had earned her place in the world, scars and all, and, if Mark was there, she would face him. She would demand the truth. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, washed clean by the night's storm. Anya put on a simple, clean white shirt and a pair of dark blue jeans. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the familiar, damaged landscape of her face. For a moment she was tempted to try and cover the scars, to use makeup to blend in, to make herself less conspicuous. But she resisted the urge. Her scars were part of her story. To hide them would be to deny a part of herself. She clipped Tripp's leash to his collar. She wasn't sure if dogs were allowed at the ceremony, but she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him alone. He was her rock, her constant source of strength. Together they walked out of the small cottage and into the bright morning sun, heading towards the center of town, towards the waiting crowd, towards the visiting general, towards the storm that was about to break. She didn't know what the day would bring, but she was ready to face it. The quiet life was over. The battle for Havenwood had just begun. Memorial Day dawned bright and clear, the air scrubbed clean by the previous night's storm. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees and sent the hundreds of American flags lining Main Street snapping smartly in the wind. The town of Havenwood was dressed in its Sunday best, a sea of red, white, and blue. The entire population, it seemed, had turned out for the occasion. Anya and Tripp arrived at the town square to find it already packed with people. Families had set up lawn chairs, children waved small flags, and the high school band was warming up on a makeshift stage. The atmosphere was festive, a strange mix of solemn remembrance and a celebratory reunion. Anya felt a pang of anxiety as she navigated the crowd. She was used to wide-open spaces, to having a clear line of sight. Being surrounded by so many people, their bodies pressing in on all sides, made her feel claustrophobic. She found a spot near the back, under the shade of a large maple tree, hoping to remain as inconspicuous as possible. Tripp sat patiently at her feet, his tail giving a soft thump-thump against the grass. From her vantage point, Anya had a clear view of the stage and the war memorial, which was adorned with wreaths of red poppies. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a tall, thin man in a grey hoodie. She didn't see him, but she did see Carol Pritchard and her friends. They were seated in a reserved section near the front, their dresses crisp and their hair perfect. Carol was holding a clipboard, looking every bit the important organizer, occasionally turning to give instructions to a hurried-looking volunteer. Her gaze swept over the crowd, a queen surveying her subjects, and for a moment it rested on Anya. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, a clear sign that she had noticed Anya's presence and disapproved. Anya held her gaze, her expression unreadable, until Carol looked away with a dismissive sniff. The ceremony began with an invocation from the local pastor, followed by the national anthem, played with heartfelt enthusiasm by the high school band. The mayor, a portly man with a booming voice, gave a long-winded speech about the history of Havenwood and its proud tradition of military service. Anya listened with a detached sense of duty, her mind elsewhere. She was still scanning the crowd, her senses on high alert. Every tall man, every hooded sweatshirt, sent a jolt of nervous energy through her. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The mayor cleared his throat and puffed out his chest. And now, he boomed, "It is my distinct honor to introduce a true American hero, a son of Havenwood, a man who has dedicated his life to the service of our great nation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming home General Theron Miller." A wave of applause swept through the crowd. Everyone rose to their feet, their faces turned towards the side of the stage. A black sedan had pulled up, and from it emerged a figure that seemed to have stepped directly out of a history book. General Miller was even more imposing in person than he was in his photographs. He was a tall man, ramrod straight, with a shock of white hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He wore his dress uniform, the dark green fabric adorned with so many ribbons and medals that it looked like a shield of honor. He moved with a quiet authority, a man completely at ease with his own power. He walked onto the stage and shook the mayor's hand, a faint, polite smile on his lips. He surveyed the crowd, his gaze sharp and intelligent, taking in the sea of faces turned up towards him. For a moment, his eyes seemed to pass over Anya, and she felt an involuntary urge to stand up straighter, to square her shoulders, a reflex from a lifetime ago that the general's voice, when he spoke, was not the booming command she had expected. It was a deep, resonant baritone, calm and measured, yet it carried across the square with an effortless clarity. He didn't use a lot of flowery language. He spoke simply, directly, from the heart. He talked about growing up in Havenwood, fishing in the local creek and playing baseball in the fields that were now subdivisions. He spoke of the friends he had lost, the names of whom were etched on the granite memorial behind him. He talked about the meaning of service, of sacrifice, of the sacred duty to protect the freedoms that so many took for granted. "We are here today to honor the fallen," he said, his voice growing softer, more somber. "But we are also here to honor the living, the men and women who have worn the uniform, who have stood the watch, who have borne the burdens of war and returned home, to a nation that does not always understand their sacrifice." As he spoke these words, his eyes swept over the crowd again, and this time, Anya was sure they lingered on her for a fraction of a second longer. A strange feeling, a mixture of dread and a bizarre sense of connection, washed over her. It was impossible, he couldn't know her. She was just another face in the crowd, a nobody. The general's speech was met with a thunderous ovation. He nodded graciously, his expression unchanged. The ceremony continued with the unveiling of the statue, a bronze likeness of the general in his younger days. Then, the high school band played taps, the mournful notes of the bugle hanging in the still air, a poignant tribute to the dead Dot. As the ceremony concluded, the crowd began to disperse. People surged forward, hoping to get a closer look at the statue, or perhaps even to shake the general's hand. Anya had no intention of doing either. She wanted to slip away, to retreat to the safety of her cottage. She turned to leave, her hand on Tripp's leash, when a voice stopped her. Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence. It was Carol Pritchard. She was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, a smug, self-satisfied look on her face. Brenda and Janice were flanking her, their expressions mirroring their leaders. "I must say, I'm surprised to see you here," Carol continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "I didn't think you were the patriotic type." Anya said nothing. She just looked at Carol, her silence a more powerful response than any words. She could have spoken. "Don't you have anything to say for yourself?" Carol pressed, clearly annoyed by Anya's lack of reaction. "Or are you just going to stand there and stare at us with that unpleasant expression on your face?" "I came to pay my respects," Anya said, her voice low and even, "just like everyone else." "Respect," Brenda snickered. "What would you know about respect? You hide away in that rundown shack of yours. You don't talk to anyone, you don't even try to fit in. You just walk around with that face, like you want everyone to feel sorry for you." The cruelty of the words, spoken so casually in the middle of a crowd on a day of supposed unity and remembrance, took Anya's breath away. She felt a hot flash of anger, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in a long time. But before she could respond, Janice, the retired teacher, stepped forward. "Carol, Brenda, that's enough," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, shame, perhaps, or a belated sense of decency. Carol shot her a look of pure venom. "Don't you start, Janice. I'm just saying what everyone is thinking. She doesn't belong here. She's an eyesore. And on a day like today, when we have a distinguished guest like General Miller here, it's just embarrassing." It was then that Anya saw him, over Carol's shoulder. Standing near the stage was Mark Jensen. He was no longer trying to hide. He was staring directly at her, his face a mask of anguish. He looked like he wanted to say something, to do something, but he was frozen, trapped by his own ghosts. And then, another figure emerged from the crowd around the stage. It was General Miller. He was walking slowly, shaking hands with well-wishers, his aides trying to gently guide him towards his waiting car. But the general seemed to be in no hurry. He was looking around, his sharp eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, as if he was searching for someone. His gaze fell upon the small group under the maple tree, Carol, Brenda, Janice, and the silent, scarred woman they were tormenting. He saw the smug cruelty on Carol's face, the shame on Janice's, the anguish on the face of the young man standing in the distance, and the quiet, unbreakable dignity on the face of the woman with the scars. He changed his course. He began to walk towards them, his steps slow and deliberate. A hush fell over the people around them as they realized the general was approaching. Carol's face lit up. She thought he was coming to thank her for organizing the event. She straightened her dress and put on her most charming smile. "General Miller," she gushed as he stopped in front of them. "It is such an honor. I'm Carol Pritchard, the head of the welcoming committee. I hope everything has been to your satisfaction." General Miller did not look at Carol. His eyes were fixed on Anya. He looked at her scars, not with pity or disgust, but with a look of profound recognition and respect. The polite, distant smile he had worn all morning was gone, replaced by an expression of deep, somber gravity. He took another step forward, stopping directly in front of Anya. The crowd around them fell completely silent. Their curiosity piqued. Carol's smile faltered, confusion clouding her face. The general raised his hand, not to shake hers, but in a slow, formal salute. It was a gesture of such profound respect that a gasp rippled through the onlookers. And then he spoke. His voice, a low, powerful rumble that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. He did not say her name. He said something else, a single word, a name that no one in Heavenwood had ever heard, a name that belonged to a ghost, a hero, a legend. "Valkyrie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good to see you again." "Soldier," the general's word hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a piece of shrapnel. It was a word that meant nothing to the people of Heavenwood, a strange, almost mythical term that seemed out of place in their quiet, orderly world. But it landed on Anya like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The faces in the crowd blurred into a watercolor wash of confusion. The rustling of the leaves, the distant laughter of children, the hum of the town, it all faded into a dull, roaring silence. All she could see was the general's face, his stormy eyes filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. All she could hear was that one word, her Callsign, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, a name she had buried along with the rest of her past. Carol Pritchard was the first to break the spell. She let out a short, nervous laugh, a sound like breaking glass. "Valkyrie," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "General, I'm afraid you must be mistaken. This is Anya Sharma. She just moved here a few months ago." She said Anya's name with a hint of distaste, as if it were a foreign object in her mouth. The general did not take his eyes off Anya. "There is no mistake, ma'am," he said, his voice cold and hard as steel. He turned his gaze on Carol, and for the first time, the full force of his command presence was unleashed. It was not the gentle, grandfatherly persona he had shown on stage. This was the look of a man who had sent soldiers into battle, a man who had made life and death decisions, a man who did not suffer fools gladly. Carol visibly flinched, her smug confidence evaporating like mist in the sun. "I know exactly who this is," the general continued, his voice low but carrying to every person in the now silent crowd. "I would know her anywhere." He turned back to Anya, his expression softening slightly. "It's been a long time, Sergeant," he said, his voice now filled with a gentle respect. We were all very sorry to hear what happened. We were told, that you were gone." Anya finally found her voice, though it was little more than a ragged whisper. "The reports were wrong, sir," she said, the word "sir" coming to her lips as naturally as breathing, a relic of a life she thought she had left behind. "Clearly," the general said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips, "and I have never been so glad to see a report be so wrong." The crowd was buzzing now, a low murmur of confusion and speculation. Who was this woman? What was a Callsign? Why was a four-star general saluting her? They looked from the general's decorated uniform to Anya's scarred face, and for the first time, they began to see a connection. The scars were not from a car accident or a house fire. They were from something else, something far more terrible, something that had earned her the respect of a living legend. Carol Pritchard, however, was not ready to concede. Her social standing, her entire identity in this town, was built on a foundation of knowing everyone and everything. This was an anomaly she couldn't compute. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shrill with frustration. "What is going on here? What is this Valkyrie nonsense?" The general turned to her, his patience clearly at an end. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "Valkyrie is not nonsense. It is a name that was earned with blood and sweat, and a courage that you, in your comfortable life, could not possibly comprehend. It is the Callsign of one of the finest combat medics I have ever had the honor of serving with. The words combat medic rippled through the crowd, each syllable a small shockwave. A combat medic, a woman who ran into the thick of battle, unarmed, to save the lives of others. It was a concept so foreign, so heroic, that the people of Havenwood could barely grasp it. Brenda, the gossip blogger, was staring at Anya, her mouth agape, her phone forgotten in her hand. For once she was speechless. Janice, the retired teacher, had tears in her eyes. She looked at Anya with an expression of profound shame and regret. She had judged this woman, this hero, based on nothing more than the scars on her face. Anya felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a scene from a movie. The general's words were defending her, honoring her, but they were also stripping her bare, exposing the very past she had tried so hard to hide. She felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, their curious, pitying, and now awestruck gazes more intense than ever. It was then that she saw Mark again. He had moved closer, drawn by the unfolding drama. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, his face a torment of conflicting emotions. He looked at Anya, then at the general, then back at Anya. There was a desperate plea in his eyes, a silent message she couldn't decipher. The general seemed to notice him too. His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition in their depths. He looked from Mark to Anya, and a piece of the puzzle seemed to click into place for him. "Sergeant Sharma," he said, his voice formal again, pulling her attention back to him. "There are some things we need to discuss. Things that have recently come to my attention. Reports that need to be corrected. Stories that need to be told." He gestured towards his waiting car. "Would you do me the honor of joining me? I believe we have a great deal to talk about." It was not a request, it was a command, albeit a gently worded one. Anya knew she had no choice, but she hesitated, her eyes flicking to Tripp, who was sitting patiently at her feet, oblivious to the human drama swirling around him. The general followed her gaze and smiled, a genuine warm smile this time. "The dog can come too," he said. "I'm sure we can find a spot for a fellow veteran." Anya nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She bent down and stroked Tripp's head, her fingers sinking into his soft fur. "Come on, boy," she whispered. "Let's go." As she straightened up, she looked at Carol Pritchard one last time. The woman's face was a mask of stunned disbelief. Her perfectly ordered world had been turned upside down. The woman she had mocked, the woman she had dismissed as an eyesore, was a war hero. The woman she had tried to drive out of her town was being personally escorted away by a 4-star general. It was a social humiliation from which she would never recover. Anya felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Carol's defeat. She just felt a profound sense of weariness. She had not asked for this. He had not wanted her past to be dragged into the light. She had just wanted to be left alone. With Tripp trotting faithfully by her side, she walked with the general towards his car. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and a dawning, horrified respect. The whispers that had followed her for months were gone, replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. As she reached the car, one of the general's aides opened the door for her. Before she got in, she looked back at the crowd one last time. Her eyes found Mark's. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a look of profound relief on his face. It was then that Anya understood. He hadn't been watching her out of malice, he had been protecting her. He had been waiting for this moment, for the truth to come out. He had brought the general here. The car door closed, shutting out the stares and the silence of the crowd. Anya sank into the plush leather seat, the quiet, air-conditioned interior, a stark contrast to the emotional storm she had just weathered. Tripp hopped in after her and settled at her feet, resting his head on her knee. The general got in on the other side, and the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the town of Havenwood and its stunned inhabitants behind. Anya stared out the window at the passing streets, the familiar houses and trees now looking strange and foreign. Her quiet life was over. The silence had been broken, and now she had to face the story that had been buried for so long. The story of Valkyrie, the story of her scars. The unraveling had just begun.